history as a public servant and a public spokesman and a journalist in Israel.
We had the previous one a year ago, and we hope to do many more of these events in the future. I want to introduce to you one of the most important journalists in the world. That's because of his personality and because he covers the Middle East. Not a very easy task to cover the Middle East. Particularly because I heard that there's a small, limited conflict there, which started a few days ago and it's going to be finished soon. So in the meantime, he's covering that conflict, and it's a very important thing to do. Our guest has been involved with the Middle East journalism for many years, almost 9 years. He was there as a correspondent of Reuters for 2 years. He was there as the correspondent for the Boston Globe for 3 years or so. 6 years.
But these are over decades. You don't want to misrepresent it. In the 80s and the 90s, and then not all at once.
Even better. and now with the New York Times. So he knows the region very well, and you can see that when you read his reports. Before that, he did some other important. He had some other important positions at the New York Times. He was the assistant editorial page editor of the paper. He worked in the paper's investigative unit, focusing on September 11 attack. He got a Pulitzer Prize in 2001 for explanatory journalism, and this is really what he does when he writes from Israel. And the best proof that he does a good job is that he is criticized by everybody. The Jews on one hand and the Palestinians on the other hand. The left-wingers on the one hand and the right-wingers on the other hand. If you are criticized by everybody, it means you're in the right, at the proper place where you should be. So without an hour, and then we'll open it to questions and answers, I'm sure.
Quick correction, the Pulitzer goes to the writers. I was an editor on that series, so it's not my Pulitzer.
The editors are more important than
That's
the writers.
true. We all know that. But now that I'm back, it's like a pedestrian driver thing. Whatever you are, the other side's a big bunch of jerks, right? For me, it's an honor to be both with you and with Kevin, both of whose work I've known for many years, and don't know either particularly well, but know them a little bit. So it's really an honor for me to be here, and this is a school I've known about for a long time. So thanks for having me. I think I'll talk to you about two sets of things. One is the practice of journalism in Jerusalem and the Middle East generally, and the other is the conflict itself. And then we can talk about either and all of it together afterwards. Before I came, I was talking to an Israeli friend. He said to me, "So you're going to the States, what are you going to do?" I said, "Well, I have a couple of talks I'm giving." He said, "Whom are you addressing?" I said, "Well, it's different groups. I'm talking to some college students, and I'm talking also to a Jewish group." And he said, "Well, you tell those college students that Israel is not a racist, fascist, apartheid state." I said, okay. He said, "And you tell the Jews it is." And the reason that I tell you the story, apart from being rather amusing, is that there is something there. It's not just amusing. It's that the sort of relative nature of truth and falsehood in this conflict is so overpowering, and particularly so overpowering because those who feel so strongly about it feel very much that's a black and white story. And that's not at all my goal. My goal also, because this is, in many ways, if you followed the story, you know that it hasn't in certain ways changed very much. Sometimes I think I could take stories from my Reuters days in 1984 and put them in the New York Times and nobody would notice. So in a lot of ways, the constants of the story have stayed the same, and there's been a long and very distinguished tradition of correspondents writing about it. So in some ways, you come and you say, what is it that I can add to this? And so to some extent, what I feel my task is, apart from reporting the news, is to ask you to challenge your own assumptions, or force you to challenge your own assumptions if you feel strongly about the thing. So that if you are a person who looks at this conflict and says, no matter what the Jews do, they're going to hate them. Anything that any Jewish state is doomed in the region, then I want to introduce you to characters, to narrative lines, to details, to facts that will force you at least to question that belief. And if you're a person who says, if only Israel would get out of the West Bank and help a Palestinian state set up, there would be peace in that region, then again, I want to introduce you to people, to narrative lines, to details, and to facts, which will force you to say, that may not be true. In other words, in a conflict that is very black and white, I traffic in gray, and as Yoram said, it's a great way to get people to hate you, and I've actually been unusually successful at that. When you're a foreign correspondent, maybe when you're a correspondent anywhere, but particularly when you're far away and people are strange to the readers, you have two contradictory things that you want to tell your readers at home. They're both true, and they're the opposite one of the other. The first is, the people here that I'm writing about love their children, they bleed when you prick them, they care about the future, they laugh at funny things, they like ice cream, they like adventure movies. In other words, they're people just like you and me. You need to know that about them. You need to sense their humanity through what I do. But the second thing that I want to tell people is that if you think that by knowing that the people here bleed when you prick them, love their children, like action movies, like ice cream, that you understand them because they're like you, you're crazy. These people are completely different from you and me. They have a whole different set of social, cultural, and religious assumptions about the world, and you need to understand them to understand what's going on. So I sort of toggle between these two thoughts as I try to produce the stories that I do. And, you know, you can get caught toggling too. It's not an easy thing. In this country, which is generally pro-Israel, there is an assumption, certainly in the many people who yell at me from the right, that Israel gets a raw deal in the media. And one of the things I want to tell you, if you're one of those people, is that everybody gets a raw deal in the media. It's not just Israel. If we had a computer here and wanted to open it up to, say, the World section of the Times and take a look at what we write about France or Russia or South Africa or China, you'll find that good news does not predominate anywhere about anything that we do. Journalism is not about good news. It's about conflict and trouble and difficulty. That's what we focus on. It's not focused purely on Israel. Even in New York, right? We don't write 1 million people went to work today and came home and had dinner with their family. We write about the guy who got shot in the face and thrown in the East River. That's what we do. And it's not just journalism. I think it's actually how we as people narrate our lives to ourselves subconsciously. Journalism isn't smart enough to impose itself on people. It just reflects a human narrative tendency. So that if you were on vacation in Italy for a week and had a wonderful time eating great food and seeing wonderful churches, and then on the last day there you got beaten up and robbed, it would be for the rest of your life the week that you got beaten up and robbed. And that's how journalism functions. It focuses on that thing. So it's really not about Israel. At least that's not, at least as I view it. Now everybody, all the correspondents in the paper have more than one story that they need to cover. A person who's based in Rio needs to cover Brazil and Argentina, and these are not countries that particularly get along. They have a long history of conflict, and so he needs to, in this case it's he find his way between these two stories. But my situation is not just separate stories, but utterly competing stories at every step along the way. Everything that Israel believes about itself, the Palestinians believe the opposite about it, about themselves and about it, and vice versa. So that it's, you're faced with this incredible challenge of how to tell this story. And in fact, there's a linguistic challenge that's inherent in this, because each side labels things in a way to its advantage and to the disadvantage of the other. So that thing that's snaking its way down along and inside the West Bank barrier, West Bank border line is to Palestinians a wall, because that sounds aggressive. To Israel, it's a fence, because that sounds neighborly. And to the New York Times, it's a barrier, because we hope it doesn't sound like anything. that thing in the center of the old city of Jerusalem that's raised up a bit on a hill, is it the Temple Mount, which is what 650 Jews in the world think, or is it the noble sanctuary, which is what the 2 billion Muslims think? And does the noble sanctuary predominate because there are more of them? Does the Temple Mount win out because they were there first? How do you figure this out? And every time you write about it, what do you do about that? There are questions about what's a terrorist, what's terrorism. We, for example, at the paper, forever never called what was going on there terrorism. Terrorism was not a word that the paper was very interested in until September 11th, and suddenly every third thing that occurred in the world was terrorism. So suddenly we kept getting letters from people saying, well, why is that terrorism and why isn't that terrorism? And they were good questions, to which we didn't have particularly good answers, and there is no real answer to it yet. I can tell you that my tendency is to avoid the word, not entirely, but because I don't think it's that helpful to sort of describe what has happened. But if someone has blown up children in a cafeteria, I mean, call it terrorism, right? So don't ban it. But these things are very difficult and people are very emotional about it. I gave a talk several years ago in a Westchester synagogue when I was still the deputy foreign editor before I took this correspondent job. And we had come up with this fence wall barrier thing. We had talked about it. The correspondent at the time was James Bennett, a brilliant correspondent. He was the editor of The Atlantic today. This was sort of the decision to come up with the word barrier. And I remember telling it in a talk, and afterwards people come up to me and ask me something, and a woman came up to me and asked me a question, and in my answer I said to her, well, the barrier, and she starts poking me in the chest and saying, fence, you're talking to a fence person right now. Okay? She wasn't at all interested in the idea of neutrality. It was like, I'm on the fence side. That's all you need to know. So it's, I think, a very serious and complicated thing to deal with. Now, when I was in the region for the Boston Globe in the 90s, Shimon Peres, who's today the president of Israel, at that time was minister of many different things at different times, wrote a book called The New Middle East. It was an awful book, by the way, but not an awful idea. It just wasn't a very serious book. But the point is that his idea was that somehow Israel, through its technical advances, through its skills, would reach out to its neighbors, and there would be a kind of Singapore-like relationship in which peace would reign. Now, obviously, it didn't happen. The idea of putting aside ancient rivalries, the acceptance of Israel, none of that happened, and Israel's relationship to the region didn't change the way he had hoped it to. But I would say that today, in the last 8 months or so, we have a new Middle East, just not the one that Shimon Peres envisioned. There is an incredible change, volcano that's rolling across this region right now. Of course, the killing of Gaddafi the other day is just the latest example of an incredible set of events that's going on there. The elections in Tunisia with this Islamist party that's been victorious. It's clear, very clear, what people want to tear down in this region. I think it's far less clear what people are hoping to put in its place. And I think any sane person would watch these events and be both thrilled and terrified. It's not a question of whether it's good for America or bad for America, good for the Jews or bad for the Jews. It's just a question of what several hundred million people's lives are going to be like in the coming decade or two. And I would say that you might say, look, anything that comes is better than what was, and the sad truth is that may not be true. It actually could be worse. If you think about what's happening in Syria, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing what's happening in Syria, it's a very uplifting thing, but what replaces Assad may in fact be chaos and horror. Churchill said something that I love. He said, the future, though imminent, is obscure. And that's how it feels right now, watching all these things that are going on. I'm not lamenting it. I mean, really what happened in Tahrir Square, and I was able to be part of that coverage for part of it, it was an incredibly inspiring thing to observe. And the Pharaoh has been brought down, and that's a great thing. But it's just not clear what this fire is going to lead to. And I'd say that what we really need in watching it is a degree of humility and patience, and it's very hard to have that in what we do for a living. the thing that's really impressed me of the change of the last 8 months, and this is based again on my years when I was here in the region for the Globe, it was not to just cover Israel-Palestine, but the whole region. It's a much smaller paper. I was covered the whole Middle East, so I wandered around, and one of probably the central characteristic of these societies was fear of the regime, just fear. And I mean, I remember being in Iraq under Saddam Hussein in the mid-90s, and if you remember the war, the revolution, all the things that have happened in the last 10 years or so, you'll remember that monument in central Baghdad of two arms like this, based lovingly on the arms of the great leader. And it was a monument to the victory over Iran in the Iran-Iraq war. And it's an amazing, horrible piece of kitsch that when I first saw it, I asked the driver to please slow down and stop so that I could look at it more closely, and he said to me, "I can't slow down, they'll kill me." Now, whether they really would have, I don't know, but the idea that a guy driving in downtown Baghdad is afraid to slow down at a public monument tells me and you what it means to live that kind of fear. So what has happened in the last 8 months is the fear is gone. They've pulled back the curtain. They found the Wizard of Oz, and he's a sad old man with shoe polish in his hair. He's not what they thought he was. So it's infuriating, it's terrifying to look at these things, but the question is, in these societies that have long lacked institutions, how are they going to move forward? And the question, of course, is one that animates all of us as we watch the plays. The big question is, who can ride this tiger? Who can tame this tiger? Will it be Islamism? And if it is that a bad thing? What we know is that, for example, the Egyptian military is scared to death of that tiger. It spends its time patting the tiger's head and saying, nice tiger, everything's going to be fine, because they know that this tiger ate their guy Mubarak for breakfast, and they don't want it to happen to them. If this volcano had erupted when Shimon Peres had written his book in the mid-90s, I think Israel's reaction to it, its interaction with this set of revolutions would have been very different. It was a very different time. It was a moment Purim remembers very well, because there was a moment of hope. It was sort of standard view that a two-state solution was kind of around the corner. But then, of course, the Second Intifada occurred, Hezbollah, the withdrawal from Lebanon, the withdrawal from Gaza, a whole series of events occurred that turned the society quite sour on the idea of peace. There was also a demographic shift. 1 million people came from the former Soviet Union who were not particularly oriented toward compromise on these questions. And Israel is basically today, I don't want to overstate it, but it has largely written off the idea of coming to terms with its neighbors. It is, and this is partly been helped by the change in the global economy, the fact that Israel doesn't actually need to deal with its immediate neighbors for it to prosper, because of it's got all these companies on the NASDAQ, it's got all of this sort of digital stuff that it's been very good at, all that startup nation stuff. And this is the sort of paradox about Israel today. It's never been richer. It's never been more peaceful internally. There's no violence, essentially, internally. It's never been a more pleasant place to live, if you like, inside the bubble of the Tel Aviv world, if you like. And I mean, I first started visiting Israel in 1965. My father had a sabbatical at the Weizmann Institute. 1965, I'm sure you remember well, there was no television, there were basically no telephones, there was basically no food. I mean, there was stuff people put in their mouths, but believe me, there was no food. And today, it is a remarkable place to eat, to drink, to hang out. It's a very sophisticated place. Of course, it's got per capita, the world's largest venture capital industry, the highest number of high-tech startups in the world. It's joined the OECD. And the old Jewish joke that why did they wander for 40 years in the desert to find the one place where there was no oil or gas? We have to hang that joke up. They found massive amounts of natural gas off the northern coast. in recent years, and Israel is going to become an energy exporter almost certainly in the next 3 or 4 years. One of the things that also has struck me in the last months about Israel, if you've been watching, you know about the social protests, rather like all the things that are going on everywhere in the world today. And we did write a story just before Occupy Wall Street got serious, in which we grouped what was happening in Israel with India and Spain and other places, and Britain. Now it's kind of spread everywhere. But it felt to me very much that all of this wealth I'm talking to you about had led to a sense of fragmentation, to a feeling that the great old days were gone, the equality was gone, the egalitarianism was gone, and the desire to kind of reach out and be part of some larger community, that was part of what was driving this thing, and part of what drove the whole Gilad Shalit business as well. This idea, I wrote about this in the paper, that my sense was that Gilad Shalit was kind of a dress rehearsal for these social protests. People marched, they had a tent, and they could kind of all agree on something, because generally Israel has been divided very, very viciously over the question of Palestine. But once you take it out of the public discussion, and it is largely gone from the public discussion today, then you can sort of focus on this thing, this yearning, and that's what I believe has been happening, and I believe that's partly what drove Netanyahu to finally cut the deal, although of course there were other elements that why Hamas also yielded in certain ways its concerns about Syria and the changes that it offered in the deal, and the concern about Shalit himself. But I feel that this relationship has been a very interesting one, and I think that it is driving the society in ways where we don't know where it's going, but I don't think it's going toward reconciliation with the Palestinians. One of the things that we clearly saw in this Shalit deal is an increase of the power, at least temporarily, of Hamas, and the decline of the Palestinian Authority under Fatah and Mahmoud Abbas. You know, right after Shalit and the 477 people were released a week or two ago, the shouts on the streets, both of Gaza and of the West Bank, were, let's get ourselves another Shalit. This worked pretty well. We need another one of these guys. This is good. And that sort of drive to sort of keep up a Hamas-type activity is going to grow, I think, as we move forward. And I think that what it's going to also do is it's going to increase the IDF, the Israeli military's activity in the West Bank. And in fact, I've been in the States now for a few days. I came on Saturday, but I'm reading the paper, and in the last few days, already the IDF has arrested about 25 people in Bethlehem, raided what they said was a Hamas place in East Jerusalem. You need to know that every night, the IDF goes into Palestinian cities about a half a dozen times to clean up, if you like, from their perspective. And they used to do it about a dozen times, and in the last 2 or 3 years, they've been pulling back. But it seems clear to me, as a result of the Shalit deal, that they will step it up. And they'll step it up, Hamas will step it up. And of course, the question is, where's it headed? And I can't answer that question. It's a little bit like a rotting tooth. You know it's not going anywhere good, but you can't see under the gum. You don't know if it's going to fall out next week or next year. And it may never fall out. But it is a very, very sad situation. If you would like to see coexistence, if you would like to see the two live together, it is a very sad situation. The Palestinian Authority has essentially given up on negotiating with this government. Perhaps it's given up generally on negotiations with Israel. And of course, it has been seeking this new path through the UN in the last months. And then, of course, it overplayed its hand. It's not at all clear that it will get what it hoped from the Security Council. It may not be able to force the Americans into a veto. It may only get 8. It needs 9 votes on the Security Council. And it may then go to the General Assembly, or it may not. And if it joins UNESCO, as it apparently might, that may trigger the Americans to take their money away from UNESCO. And the American Congress, as you know, may decide to take the money away from the PA, but they might do something even cleverer and more dastardly from the Democrats' perspective. They may take the money away, but put in a waiver that says if the president considers it in the interest of the national security, that he can override that and hand the money out, which he will almost certainly do, and then they will campaign against this man who's feeding money to terrorists. You can count on it. So it's a very tough political situation in this country for what's going on there as well. I feel as I look at both sides, Israeli and the Palestinian side, that each lives with the illusion that time is on its side. The Palestinians say, every year the world likes us better and gets angrier at these guys over there. So why should we do anything but just kind of gather international support for our legitimate case? And that's what they're doing. That's the UN move, that's UNESCO, that's their hope to go to the International Criminal Court, and the desire by the PA, which we'll see if they can overcome Hamas, to focus on a kind of legal and human question rather than an actual combat question. The Israelis, on the other hand, say, you know, this is not all Israelis and not all the time, but this is an element of what's going on. They say, you know, really, if you look at the last 100 years, it's only worked when we put one foot in front of the other and just kept going, just kept building. You know, the other side, it's going to screw it up. It always has screwed it up somehow. So, you know, we'll talk about peace and so on, but if we just keep doing what we do, it'll be good for us. And actually, neither side is suffering enough to do anything to really offer anything forward to move the situation out of where it is. The Israelis and the Palestinians have also, as it were, put forward what seem to some as new demands. The Israelis say, you know what, we want you to say out loud that we are a Jewish state. And the Palestinians say, well, you've never asked that of us before. If you're asking for it now, it must be because this is just an obstacle you want, a new thing to throw in there and make it difficult to move forward. And the Palestinians say, we want you to freeze settlements before we talk. And the Israelis say, for 40 years we talked with you, you didn't make us freeze settlements. If you're making us freeze settlements, it's because you don't really want to negotiate. And what I would say is, there's truth to both accusations, and there's also truth to something else, which is each side was mistaken, perhaps, not to ask it of the other side before. Because from their perspective, the perspective of the Netanyahu government, the people around him, and I spend far too much of my life talking to them, they totally believe. And I think it's an interesting argument that the core problem has been the other side has never accepted the idea of Jewish sovereignty on any part of this land. The whole idea of Zionism, it has no historic legitimacy from the other side's perspective, and I think that is true. It has no legitimacy from the other side's perspective. And the Palestinians will say, well, if we didn't ask you to freeze settlements before, it was our mistake. We should have. Because what's happening is the place we want to create as our state is disappearing under our feet. So you know what? It was a mistake not to before, and now we're asking for it. So I would say that each side has legitimate argument. I'll make one or two more points and then we'll turn it over to you. The core movement on each side has never wanted a two-state solution. This is a sort of relatively new idea. Of course, it began in '47. I don't mean that there was never any idea, but the idea of each national movement was always to have it all. That's why. And they've done things to promote that over the years, making a two-state solution very difficult. One quick example from each side. On the Palestinian side, hundreds of thousands of people are kept in refugee camps in the West Bank, in Gaza, in Jordan, in Lebanon, and in Syria. Hundreds of thousands of people with the keys to their disappeared homes and the deeds and the leases and so on, and told, you will be going home to Haifa and Jaffa, just hang in there. On the Israeli side, as soon as they conquered the West Bank, within a decade, they began strategically to place settlements there. What was the point of the settlements? To make it impossible for anyone else to build another entity on that land. It worked pretty well. So both sides have worked very hard at making this whole idea of the thing that they both profess to want, a two-state solution, impossible. It's the core DNA of each side's movement. And it has made it very difficult to disentangle from that. There are now between 500,000 and 600,000 Israelis living beyond the Green Line. And this government, in my opinion, will not move one settler, not one. And I would be surprised if any government could move anything like what's needed for a proper solution, and that's 80 to 90,000 settlers. I see no chance of that. The current thinking is they should stay. The Palestinian argument is, if they stay, we refuse to have them stay. Of all the Jews in the whole world, these are the guys you want to live with us? Forget it. So there is an amazing set of interlocking impossibilities to make this thing be resolved. I'm here to give you that sad news. Thank you very much.
So let me just ask one question, which has to do with in this quite astonishing description of a kind of reverse parallax, where each side has taken steps to make the other side's view of its own security untenable. At the same time, constantly exploring or talking about or submitting to external calls, initiatives, sequences, often led by the United States, but also joined in by a number of other countries, to see if there can't be some way forward that would actually achieve what you have just described very powerfully, and perhaps even very persuasively, as unachievable outcomes. In the lifetimes of the people in this room, do you see any sequence that can resolve any of this in any way other than the withdrawal of 80 to 90,000 people whom others do not want living in those places, and commitments to the safety, security, and integrity of the State of Israel?
I don't. I mean, we as Americans, I've been brought up to sort of think, you know, just roll up your sleeves down, we can solve this. And interestingly, when the Obama administration came in to office 2.5 years ago, I know from having talked to members of it, the thinking was, you know, the one thing we actually could fix is that one. We could make that, it's clear, we all know how it should end. So let's make it work. And it was an utter failure. Now, you know, I would be delighted to be proven wrong, but I just don't see how it's going to happen. I don't see how the domestic politics in this country are going to allow a president to put the kind of pressure on both sides that would be required for them to actually act in ways that their own domestic politics won't allow them to act. And again, I don't think domestic politics here will allow the president to do it. And I can't see any government in Israel surviving that would try to remove that many settlers. I can't see Palestinians accepting their staying. And I mean, I don't, as I said before, I don't feel that anyone is in a deep enough pain to actually make the sacrifices that are required. So the question is, what is that, where does it go? And I don't know how to answer that, but I can see it just sort of slowly falling off a cliff for many years.
May I ask a question before we
Yeah, sure.
turn it over to the wonderful students and faculty? More about your professional work. In what way are you, as the representative of the New York Times, what position do you have in Israeli in the Israeli media scenery? Are you leading the news of other newspapers because they copy from you, they watch what you do? What is the relations between the American journalists and the European ones? What are the relations between yours and the Israeli ones? In what way you get more advantages than others when you want to talk to Israeli leaders? Tell us more about your daily work.
Sure.
Thank you.
Israeli media are actually very robust and hardworking, and they produce a lot of serious stuff. I mean, the media in Israel have suffered in the economy the way all media around the industrialized world have, and 10 or 15 years ago, the Israeli media were better than they are today, but they're still pretty good. So it would be presumptuous and wrong for me to say that they follow me. That's not the truth. I follow them. I read every word with great care. I check it, but But there's a lot of serious work that goes on there. Now, they watch what I do because it matters to them how they're presented, how they're viewed, and so on. I would say that as the society has moved to the right, which is the case, the New York Times used to be kind of the in-house newspaper, the one they all love. Now it's, what's wrong with that newspaper? Why do they hate us? And there is a sort of general sense that the New York Times is anti-Israel. If you are a strong sympathizer of the Palestinians, I know that you're having trouble sitting on your seat right now because the Palestinian and pro-Palestinian movement views us as basically an extension of the Zionist Organization of America. But that is how it's viewed in Israel. And we get a lot of, I know the sort of symbol of it, if you like, is Tom Friedman, who is, you know, incredibly well known in Israel. He had my job 25 years ago, won a Pulitzer for his incredibly fine work at the time, and has written a lot of columns that relate to Israel over his years as a columnist. When Gail Collins was the editorial page editor of the Times and had never been to Israel, she went with Tom, this is about 5 or 8 years ago, to Israel for a week, and when she came back, she said going to Israel with Tom Friedman is like going to the mall with Britney Spears. So, you know, it's just, and I know this because he's, in my 3.5 years there, he's visited about 5 times. He's, by the way, just a phenomenal colleague. He's just generous and lovely in all ways. But he, so when word gets out in Israel that Tom has set foot on the soil, it's like the chief of staff called, everybody wants to see Tom. But now, because he's written maybe a dozen very harsh columns about Benjamin Netanyahu and what he's done, his policy, he's now persona non grata, and the whole sort of political establishment is angry at him and angry at the Times and therefore angry at me. So it's a little complicated. It's not what it was when I arrived a few years ago. That said, as you know from the little CV that you were read, I worked in Israel for Reuters and for the Boston Globe and for the New York Times, and let me tell you, it's a better deal. It's like Cher once said, I've been rich, I've been poor, rich is better. The New York Times is better. It's a good place to work, okay? In all ways, and I do have much, much better access to officials on both sides than I did when I worked for Reuters or the Boston Globe, although, you know, the access is not bad for anyone, to be honest. It's a good place to be a reporter. It's a place where everybody gets up in the morning and thinks, you know, how can I get in the newspaper today? So it's a good place to work as a reporter. From any medium, honestly, you can get access to people. That's not my relationship with the European media. I don't have anything really to say about it. I mean, we are colleagues. There are a bunch of fine reporters from the European media. We see each other, you know, in shitholes here and there, and, you know, when things blow up, or when there's a press conference, or when we're being yelled at. And some of them are closer than others, but I will say that I think that the focus of the European media is more focused on pro-Palestinian move. I mean, pro-Palestinian is sort of the wrong word. It's more about that the story for them is about the suffering of the Palestinians. It's not really about Israeli society per se. The story, they're there to chronicle what has happened to the Palestinians and what's happening to them. That's how they view their role, and that's I view my role on both sides. I think it's in this. I also would say this is obviously a generalization, but that there's an underlying question in some of the European newspapers and magazines' coverage of the place, and that underlying question is this country really legitimate? Is it okay what happened in 48? And I would say that American media don't really have that question underlying their coverage. There are questions about its treatment, and how it handles itself, but not, is this whole enterprise wrong? Okay, shall I just pick the lead?
Okay. Speaking about fairness in the New York Times.
Was that what we were speaking about?
Well, that was what
that's
the
what we're going
program
to
said
speak about, I
to
can
speak
tell.
about.
How can I help you?
And, well, for over 30 years now, the New York Times has had a policy of never mentioning the Jordanian takeover of the West Bank and East Jerusalem.
Be really careful about assertions.
No,
about policy.
except two minor exceptions, one including a column by you last week. But actually, they never mention that because they want to mislead the public into believing,
Really have no desire to mislead the public.
into believing that the Arabs have had possession of the West Bank and East Jerusalem since
But
antiquity.
who's they? Who's they? Who is they? Who is they that wants that? Who is it?
Well, let me ask you, other than your column on
Tell
Parat,
me who is behind this design.
I was going to ask you that, but I believe it's a publishing.
There is no
I'll tell
they
you who I
there.
believe it is. I believe it's a publishing family. I think it's the
Really?
Yacht Sulzberger
I
family.
have
yes.
never had a conversation with Mr. Salzberger about my coverage, ever. So I can put whatever I want in the paper.
But-
So why am I not doing
So are
it?
you going to tell me that there are, other than the mention in Parat's obituary and a minor article by Kirshner in January of this year on the Shepherd Hotel, are you going to tell me there actually are mentions
I am going to tell you that.
of the Jordanian takeover of, and there...
An occupation of the West Bank from 49 to 67, I'm going to tell you that. You know, we need a computer here so that I can prove to you that I'm right.
Yeah, but you know, we've had an exchange before.
You and I?
really weren't right. My name's Herbert Grossman.
Oh, yeah.
Nice to put a face to the public editor had you respond to something I said, and you happen to be wrong on that.
Really? I've never been wrong before, you sure?
All right.
Okay, we got it.
Yeah.
Sir.
Yeah. Yes. Please.
With the somewhat sad view that the status quo is going to go into the future, is it your sense from the Netanyahu government that the hinted suggestions underneath that if this doesn't go anywhere, if the Jewish population in the territory grows and grows, that there should be a point where the Palestinian Authority surrenders and says, now we all want to be part of Israel, we want to be citizens in your state, give us the vote, and is there anybody in the Netanyahu government who actually is looking at that, assuming that the status quo goes forward, and looking at it seriously, and what does that really mean?
It's a great question. It's not the mainstream Netanyahu view. In fact, there is a fear that that could happen. They don't want that to happen. Although there are people attached to this government, ministers of the government, and people who talk to it, who think that would be okay. And one of the things they say is, all the demographic data are false. It's not true that there are X number of Palestinians. In fact, we can show you that it's going to be okay. Okay, so there is actually a kind of factual dispute about how many Palestinians there are in the West Bank, which would allow it to be one whole country, and that we, the Jews, are still a majority. But the core view at the moment is more that they want the PA, the Palestinian Authority, and its security forces to continue to police in the cities, and so that they don't have to actually do the work themselves should this go forward. So, in fact, the Netanyahu government and the defense establishment are very unhappy about the idea of a fund cutoff from the United States to the Palestinian Authority. What they would like is to continue the situation, the status quo, as long as possible. And in fact, the PA is threatening the sort of thing that Saeb Erekat, the chief Palestinian negotiator, typically says when I sit down with him is, you know what? Just reoccupy me, for God's sake. I'm sick of this, okay? And you know, do whatever you want. I'm not going to do this anymore. And Abbas feels the same way. You'll see any minute he's about to walk away. And I know that there is concern that that could happen. I mean, Mahmoud Abbas is a very complicated, mercurial figure who is very unhappy, and is 76, and could walk away, and could throw the keys at the Prime Minister's office and say, take it over. We're not doing it for you anymore. I don't think that's going to happen because they do have money and privileges and it's not so easy to do. But it's a very important question you've raised, to which, as you can see, I have no clear answer.
Yes, please.
Early on, you made that analogy about getting beaten and robbed in Italy, and that's what journalism covers.
Yeah.
Right. But do you have any sense that maybe that shouldn't be what journalism covers, that you have a duty to cover something else, to look for not the story about the guy who got beaten and robbed, but
Well,
8 lovely days of
fair
summer,
question.
right?
I mean, I slightly, of course, overstated my point, and it's not entirely true what I said. because journalism is not only about trouble, it's also about surprise. And good news can be a surprise. So that if out of a poor society something extraordinary emerges, good, that's a story. So stories are about surprise. It's just that sort of steady, usually the surprise is pretty awful. I do try to vary my diet so that it includes culture and human interest stories, but I don't wander too far from the conflict very often, because it is sort of the reason I'm there. Okay, I mean, honestly, if there were no conflict, we really wouldn't care that much. Yes.
From what you said, I definitely had a sense of pessimism about
You have a future as a reporter.
ever like achieving any sort of peace in that region. Will you talk about, for our generation, is there any initiative, like educational, anything that you think could help us in our lifetime see an end of some sort to this conflict?
Occupy Ramallah.
Right. Part of the problem with the question for me is that I'm really not in the should business. I'm not looking to answer that question. That's not what I do all day. I'm trying to get it right. I'm trying to figure out what's actually going on and be as brutal with myself and my assumptions and everyone else's as I can. So it's a very fair and important set of questions that you raise. How can we make the world better? It's just not the question I ask myself every day.
There is a school of thought that says that that's the function of journalists.
It's not my school of thought.
Peace journalism. How do you
It's
judge
not for
that
me.
school of
Not
thought?
what I do. I'm not asked to do it. It's not why I'm there. I don't want to overstate this, because there are certain basic values that the paper stands for and that I accept that I stand for them with the paper. Freedom of religion, freedom for women, freedom of speech, freedom of the media. In other words, there are certain values that the paper stands for, and therefore it in effect praises when that goes up and condemns when it goes down. But in terms of the broader question of how to bring peace to the region, I think the paper probably stands for being in favor of it too, but it's just not a major part of what I do, is how to figure out how to make it better. I'm busy enough. You think of it. Yeah.
What made you first realize that there wasn't going to be a peace solution anytime soon? Did you ever think there was going to be a quick peace solution?
One's memory is faulty on these things, right? But I was always pretty skeptical. I have to say that in the mid to late 90s, it felt like it seemed inevitable somehow that a deal was being worked out. But I remember very distinctly so many occasions in which I saw, but the two sides don't understand what the other is saying. I remember, for example, in 1994, when Israel and Jordan signed a peace treaty, which was considered a very big deal after Oslo between the PLO and Israel. And I went to the Jordanian side for, actually it was Peres was the prime minister. What was he? Was he prime minister? What was he? 94? No, I know. So what was Peres? Foreign minister. Anyway, I remember him going. He gave a speech, and I think the name of the prime minister of Jordan was Majali. He gave a speech, and I remember that the Israelis had their cell phones, and the Peres speech was translated into 19 languages and stapled and ready, and the Jordanian speech was like 9 hours, and no one could understand what he was talking about, and the Jordanians were all incredibly depressed about this. They didn't want to be there. They thought, why are we doing this for the Israelis? They don't deserve it. And the Israelis were all wandering around and buying up all the souvenirs in the shop and saying, here I am, Mom, I'm in Jordan. And I thought, this is not going to end well. And I could feel always that the other side just didn't hear what one side was saying. So the truth is that I've been at this for almost 30 years, and pessimism has been a very steady companion, and I don't feel I should abandon it.
So you mentioned that both sides keep adding new things onto
Yes,
the.
well, as I said, it looks like it.
Yeah. Because
I actually don't think they're
they
new.
mentioned these things from the beginning,
Right.
and now they kind of tack them on.
Right.
So who would you think would need to make the first move in stopping to do this for anything to get done?
Yes, sorry, it's not my business. I'm not in the should business. I can't help you.
You were talking about how domestically it's not really like in our government here are there interests to put pressure on Israel at this point. What would need to happen in this?
On either side, I think there's pressure needed for both. That's not just on Israel.
Right. But I'm talking about domestically here, like here. No, I know you're not.
What would have to happen here?
What types of pressure and where is that going to come from? To like put pressure on Israel.
I don't know. I'm sorry. Ask me the question.
For our government to begin to
Yes.
put pressure on Israel.
What would have to happen domestically?
Yeah.
I don't know, 30 million evangelicals would have to like discover Buddhism, I think, right? I mean, there's a strong Christian, I mean, it's not the Jews, it's the Christian lobby in this country, which deeply believes in this thing, and is not going to let the president do that thing. Not going to, although he'll get rid of him.
When Israel puts forward its negotiating position that it wants to remain a Jewish state, what exactly is it asking
Right.
for?
Well, it doesn't know itself, so that's a great question. But I think that if we decided to make a referendum out of it, I could probably design a sentence that 90% of the people would vote for, and it would be that it is the homeland of the Jewish people. Okay?
So the right of return?
Well, the right of return is unquestionably going to be part of it.
Right, but not the whole world.
No. But it's the idea that the Jews are a people, not just a religious grouping, which is something that Palestinians do not accept. That they have a historic link to the land that they are on, and that it is appropriate and just that they form a sovereign entity on some portion of that land. Okay, and that its identity will be Jewish, not necessarily religious, but Jewish ethnically and culturally. That's the sort of broad definition. But the country has become more religious in the last decade or two, and the struggle over what Jewish means is very, very real. I think that if we look at Ennahda, the new party that seems to have won in Tunisia, my gut is that it's the National Religious Party of Tunisia, the Mafdal of Tunisia, which the Mafdal, the National Religious Party 60 years ago, was very moderate. And today it is not moderate at all. Religiously identified parties tend to move further and further into their own fundamentals, in my observation. Sir.
One of the surprises in Israel, at least to me, and that's been part of every year, was the protest movement this summer, this fall. On October 9th, nearly 500,000 Israelis and others were in the streets.
What date did you say?
Was it October 9th?
No, I think it was August 9th.
August.
Yeah.
That's true. Have you met the leaders of this movement, and what do you think that they can accomplish, or what do they hope to accomplish?
I have met them, and I don't know. I mean, they're a very interesting, dedicated group who, I've met, I've circulated in these demonstrations, but I've sort of sat with 3 of them. And whether they will remain as the leaders, I don't know. A guy called Yonatan Levy is one guy, Daphne Leaf is another, Stav Schiffer is another. They are very idealistic, very hardworking, very devoted, and pretty left-wing on all issues, by the way. And they are, not sure what to do about the left-wing thing, because Israel is not left-wing, and that Israel has backed their movement as long as it doesn't get close to that question of Palestine. But I think that it's also true that maybe like the movement here, and I know a lot less about Occupy Wall Street than doubtless you all do, what is the goal? The goal is for greater justice, for greater equality, for people to feel less crappy about things, but How you get there? What is it? You know, I'm very, very unclear about the meaning of it all and where they're going and whether they can have any serious impact outside of the political party system. And at the moment, the only impact they've had is that the Labor Party, which was about to fall off the edge of the earth, elected Shelley Yachimovich, who is more in their mold than any of the other candidates. And my gut is that, first of all, she's a very skilled politician, but the things that she stood for them before this movement began, and it sort of swept her. But, you know, she might get, if there were an election tomorrow, the Labor Party might go up to 15 or 18 seats, but is that going to change Israel? I don't know. So, I mean, I'm sorry I can't be more helpful, but it's a great question, like a lot of your questions. Yeah.
Switching back to the journalism side of this.
My which? Journalism, yeah.
When your son joined the Israeli army, was there any, what kind of pressure was on you, if any, to switch to a different correspondent, or like, what was your argument in terms of?
Well, when my son joined the Army, there was an enormous amount of pressure. I mean, there was a sort of a whole kind of internet campaign to say that I could no longer do this job, and our public editor responded and said he agreed. So you know those things, I assume, if you asked.
But I'm just like, what was your argument?
What's your question?
Like, what was your argument? What, like, in terms of?
My argument is I just keep putting one foot in front of the other. Nothing changes for me, and that's how I feel. I mean, you know, I love my son, but I mean, you know, so he's in the Army. So I mean, what do you want me to do about it? You know, and there are so many elements of this. I've been going to Israel. I'm married to an Israeli. I have, you know, my relationship with the IDF is not suddenly blossoming because my kid is in Iran. I mean, it's like, you know, I got cousins in the Army. I deal with the Army for years. You know, that doesn't necessarily make you love the Army, by the way, okay? Intimacy does not necessarily result from proximity. I mean, you don't, you know, so in fact, you could argue that it gives you a clearer view of the difficulties or the problems that's engaged in. I mean, you could imagine my boy coming home on Friday night and telling me, my God, they're exploiting people. Anyway, all I'm saying is, for me, it did nothing. Now, I don't want to say there's no such thing as conflict of interest. If he were a general leading a battle, I shouldn't be covering that war, okay? But, you know, his climbing up hillsides at 4 in the morning with a pack on his back in southern Israel did not affect my view of the conflict. It did. I promise you. You asked? I can't remember, sorry. Whoever hasn't asked. Please.
As an Israeli youth, I am very saddened to share your view about the ingrained pessimism among my peers regarding the conflict. It does seem that many of us just find no person or entity to have peace with. I was wondering from your experience if that view is shared from the Palestinian side, because it would seem to me that perhaps because of the recent Arab Spring, quote unquote, it would help maybe instill optimism on the other side, which would, I think, be beneficial for both sides to get anywhere.
The question is, the optimism for what? Because the Arab Spring has not been particularly oriented toward, let's make Israel feel okay. So, I mean, I don't think, so there are two questions you asked. One is, do Palestinian youths look at Israel and say there's no one on the other side? Yes. Yes, that's what they say. Okay, that's exactly what they say. That doesn't mean that they're right. I'm not here to defend it, but that is precisely what they say. Does the Arab Spring give one a sense that the Palestinians are going to come to terms more quickly with Israel? It does not. Did you want to ask something?
Yeah. When you write your columns and everything, what's the purpose of your writing? Is it just to be neutral? Is it to, no, I'm just interested. Is it to achieve neutrality? Is it to make people feel a certain way or think a certain thing about the conflict? Because you've expressed that, like, you're not answering should questions, but, like, what's the point, what do you view as the point of what you're writing about? Like, is it to persuade people one way or the other? Is it just to strictly inform people in an objective way?
Well, I do want people to think in a deeper way about the conflict. And I suppose on some level, the purpose of journalism is to increase the sophistication of public decisions, so that our public, those who read my stories, and they get tons of information from other places, I'm not their sole source, that they would make more informed choices for their leaders, or in terms of what this government should do about the conflict, okay? Now, I now write for a global audience because of the web. So the idea is just, I mean, I feel like there is real value in truth-telling. There's real value in it because there's so much crap out there. Everyone's emoting all. I'm just trying to help you focus on, obviously, my judgment of what's going on. But my hope is that through that judgment, something real can emerge, which will produce good. I'm with you on that. I don't want bad to come from what I write. I want good to come from what I write. But I believe that sunshine and truth and frankness will produce good. And if they won't, they will eventually. And if they won't, I'm sorry. That's the only way I know how to contribute to good, is that way.
I was wondering if you can comment on U.S. Congress's, I think at first threatening and then going through with cutting $200 million in aid to Gaza.
What kind of comment do you want from me? Whether I think it's a good idea?
Sorry?
Do you want me to tell you whether I think it's a good idea?
No, not necessarily, but I wanted to, like, if you can either predict questions that would come out of it or how it might affect.
I mean, my gut is that they will not give any more money to the PA. That's my gut. That 200 million is it's a complicated figure. It has to do with money that was already committed, that they've not passed through the hoops right now, partly to try to have some leverage over the situation. That money may end up ultimately being transferred, but I doubt that in FY12 there'll be any real money given to the Palestinian Authority, except for the way I said in my talk, which was that there'll probably be a waiver put into the bill, into the law, that will allow the president to give it out. And my gut is that the security forces will get their money for training, and because Israel and the US want those things to go forward, but that there will be a kind of punishment of the PA for its acts toward the UN and toward Hamas and so on. That's my gut.
Yes, as part of your work, do you connect with sources in the U.S. State Department?
Mm-hmm.
And if you do, do you have any sense of whether the Department of State right now sort of shares your behind the scenes, not what's said in public, but that they share your sense of kind of the futility of these short term, and if not, do they have a kind of a different view?
I think they're pretty depressed. To be fair, this is not a major part of what I do. I'm in touch with them and the ones who come through, but I mean the people in our bureau in Washington are in closer touch with them. So I don't have an intimate answer for you, but I know that they are not hopeful. They do nonetheless believe that the only way that anything can happen is through American effort, and damn it, they're going to keep trying. And I mean, that's good.
You spoke about.
Sorry, I'll come to you next. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Okay. You spoke about changes in the Israeli society over the last couple of decades,
yes.
Becoming more religious, becoming more right-wing, becoming, let's say, disillusioned with the notion of any settlement. What has happened to the Palestinians over that comparable time? Has there been big shifts in their view of things?
I would say that the core Palestinian view has always been a rejection of Israel. Briefly, in the 90s, there was not a majority, but a sizable portion of the population, approaching 50%, that was willing to live within a two-state solution. But that has, as a result of a lot of events and a lot of changes, basically gone back down now, okay? So I would say that it's always been a tough sell for the Palestinians that they should give up the dream, the whole plan, the whole idea that what they lost is properly theirs. And I would say that, there are sort of shoots coming through the ground, and it's hard to know where they're going. In the last few years, in the West Bank, there's been a focus on nonviolent resistance of some kind. I mean, it's a rather liberal definition of nonviolent. It might include some rock throwing. It's not totally, it's not completely Gandhian, but it is not shooting people, okay? But there's not a majority. A majority of Palestinians think that's crap, that it'll never change the Israelis. So, but, you know, it used to be 10% and now it's 25%. So, you know, one of the things, even though, of course, in giving a speech, I need to sort of give you a view of where it's going, I could be wrong, okay? And I think it's very important to know that things can shift. And so that 25% might, under certain circumstances, become a bigger portion. Something could happen. So, broadly, the answer is that they have lost any belief in a deal. But the other thing that's happened to Palestinians is they have lost any sense of faith in their own political order. They are just spent politically. They've just given up. Because one of the great questions about Palestinians is, why don't they do that thing that, you know, every New York Times columnist writes them every week? Why don't you just do a big, you know, march? Why don't you, you'll really embarrass the Israelis. And they can't do it, okay? They can't get 100 people together to do it. It's an overstatement. But they can't get the 10,000 or the 100,000 that they need to make it happen. They don't even have to march to Jerusalem. They could just stand up in Nablus all together one day and say, we're sick of it, we're not taking it anymore, and they can't do it because they don't have any faith that any political process will get them anywhere. Again, that could shift, but that's the feeling right now.
I'm sorry.
So
there will be no white intifada.
I don't see one.
I want to ask if somebody will ask the Iranian question.
Wait 1 second, because this woman that was raising her hand, I never got to her. Then I'll answer the non-Iranian question.
What you said sort of answered this a bit, but there was a lot of rhetoric maybe 5 or 6 or 7 years ago that even though the leadership on both the Palestinian and Israeli sides were interested about a peace process, the people were really and really wanted peace on both sides. And that was a very hopeful input to maybe having peace at some point. Has that changed?
Yes.
And was the wall and the Arab Spring, have they been big game changers?
It has changed. You're right that it was a standard talking point.
Yeah.
That the problem is the governments, the people want a deal. And there were, in fact, you know, there were data to support it. There were polls that showed 60% said, you know, do you want a two-state solution? Yes. But I always thought it was not very deep. And it has become shallower. And the numbers aren't really always there anymore. There was a fairly shocking Israeli poll in Yediot about 2 weeks ago in which the question was, would you be in favor of a two-state solution based on the 67 lines with mutually agreed swaps and an end to the conflict? And a majority said no. No. Now, you know, again, to go back to what I was saying to you about how things can shift, I don't want to say, so that's all you need to know, it's over. No, I think that the public opinion is very labile, very tired, very confused. And part of that no is they don't believe that the other side would live up to the deal. They are worried about the Arab Spring. Everything says to them, this piece of paper will be worth nothing, so I'm not in favor of it. So it's sort of like if you could promise them that it would work, would they be in favor of it? Probably. I think so. But how do you promise them that? You know, because they need to be involved in making it happen. The Iran question. What's the question exactly?
Was not asked.
Go for it, Kevin.
Well, the question that was I was thinking about is there a game changer that will change any of the dynamic that we're looking at that you've described? I don't know that Iran and its putative bomb is that game changer, but I want to just get it in front of them.
I completely agree with you. It could absolutely be. First of all, the question is, what would happen if some consensus were arrived at in the Israeli intelligence community that some point of no return was around the corner, right? Would they bomb Iran? I'd give it 50-50, okay? I mean, I don't know, but it's not out of the question by any means. And if Iran did have a bomb, would that change things enough? It would change things enormously. But, you know, let's leave the bomb aside. Let's ask, okay, the Americans leave Iraq in a couple of months. Might Iran take over Iraq? It might. If Iran were to take over Iraq and the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan were not in such great shape, the whole Eastern Front question for Israel would scare the living Jesus out of them. Okay? So the idea that they're going to sort of give up anything in the West Bank under these circumstances, this government is not going to give up an inch. Let me tell you. Right now, all it does, it looks out and it says, oh my God, terrible things are on the horizon. And I mean, I just had a conversation with a very close guy to the Prime Minister, not the Prime Minister, but an important guy in his entourage just before I came over, who said to me, look at what's happening in Syria. Imagine if it were happening on this side of the Golan Heights. Imagine if we'd cut a deal the way everyone told us 2 years ago. Thank God we didn't. That's the predominant view. Sure.
You mentioned that Israel's made plans over the next 3 years to become an oil producer.
Yeah, no, not oil, gas, natural gas. They might plan on oil, but...
Could you elaborate more on what you believe the economic implications of the economy?
Sure. I mean, it's not a great strength of mine, but I can tell you that it involves a little bit of what's going on in Egypt. 40% of Israel's natural gas is imported from Egypt, or was imported until the 5 explosions of these pipelines in the last 6 months. So it will change that enormously. It's expected to be able to export natural gas to Europe. And to make money off it, and to shift it from being poor little Israel that has to beg for energy to be able to export it. Now, there are a lot of issues there. One of them is Cyprus, Turkey, because Israel wants to cut a deal with Cyprus. Turkey is not happy about this. So there are, and Lebanon says, well, those fields that you say are yours, they're really ours. So nothing simple. But the likelihood is that they'll have enough to supply themselves and by 2016 or something be exporting. And that, the interesting thing is that Israel has always had to live by its wits, having no natural resources. And so there are, of course, Jewish sages walking around saying, oh my God, the worst thing that can happen to us is to discover natural gas, because then we're going to stop, living on edge. I've actually met Israelis who say, I don't want peace. Not having peace keeps us on our toes. Not many Israelis, but this is the idea that this is a way that we have advanced in this world, and too much security, economically or otherwise, will just turn us into flat couch potatoes.
May I ask you a question on more, again, professional? Have the changes in professional journalism, namely citizen journalism, social media, the blogs, change the way you work today compared to what you did 10 years ago or 20 years ago?
Yes. The biggest change is that a newspaper reporter in Jerusalem or anywhere, let's say Jerusalem because it's easy, it's 7 hours ahead, so you had all day. In fact, you had all night before you had to file. You could report all day, have a nice bite, you spend the evening writing your story, and if you filed at 11 or 12 o'clock at night, it was a pretty good time for your editors at home, 5, 6 p.m., to edit it and put it in the paper the next day. We are not fundamentally a newspaper anymore. We are a 24-hour global news site that once a day takes a picture of itself and prints it. And the demands all day are as great or greater than they are at that moment when they print. So it means that, for example, for the Shalit exchange, it meant that we were working at 6 a.m. producing copy for the website every hour or so, updating the story. And then at 5 p.m., we asked ourselves, what could we put in the paper that won't feel old? So it's a very different game. There are, of course, great things about it. It means that you wake up in the morning, turn on your computer, and you've got news that you didn't have before. And I think it's important, so that's fine. There is a big downside to it, which is that one of the great things about having all day to report and think, and Kevin, you know this, you did this for such a long time with such distinction, is that you get to kind of you get to think about what it is, what the main point, what the sophisticated point you want to make is. If you have 20 minutes instead of 6 hours to come up with that central point, it's harder. And also, once you've committed, it's hard to shift. So it sort of, it forces you into a narrative line a little earlier than one used to. You know, I mean, there's just, it's like complaining about the weather. You can't do anything about it. You have to live with it. But it does change things, and of course the other thing about citizen journalism and everyone's involvement with the web is that people yell at you all the time that they didn't do before. There's good things about that. Sometimes you'll put a story up and you'll get an email from someone saying, no, you got the name of the defense minister wrong in that story, and you look and you go, oh my God, and then you change it. So thank God there are people who are watching us, and then there's, you know, so it's a different world. There's no doubt about it.
In which one would you prefer to live?
I think the other one was easier, you know, sure, from my perspective. But, you know, it's a little, we were having this conversation about the digital revolution. What it's done to newspapers is it's slaughtered our industry, of course. We live by it, that's a bad thing, but what's it done for humanity? A lot of great things. I mean, the fact that, you know, you can be in some village in India or China and know as much as you and I know sitting here because you've got this in your pocket there too, right, it's quite unbelievable. How can you complain about it? I will complain about it.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question about professional practice. Assuming, as I do, that you're pretty comfortable with New York Times conventions and comfortable with all sides always criticizing you, do you think that consistently the conventions of having to kind of negotiate things about language, the barrier versus fence or wall question, for example, is an exercise that improves your ability to be a truth teller, or are there ways in which it significantly hamstrings you? That is, are there times when you say, man, I wish I could just say what I want to say instead of worrying about the wording and worrying about appearing to be neutral and so forth?
I think you've expressed it well. There's good side to it. I mean, because one of the things is you're being forced to be, someone's forcing you to be honest in a way. Someone's watching you, they're stepping on your toes and they're saying, is that the right way to say it? And they might be right that it's not the right way to say it. On the other hand, all that pressure about stuff can really kind of sap you. And it can hamper you from exploring and from soaring and so on. So it's pretty much a mixed picture. I do think there's value in it. I do think that through everyone yelling, I mean, what I try to do is to sort through the emotion and the yelling to the facts that are being presented. So that there was an interesting example where I, as it were, was caught saying something not quite right and then shifted it. This was on the day in May when a bunch of Palestinians on the Lebanese border and the Syrian border were, you know, kind of pressing on Israel in it was called Nakba Day, right? And actually it was the day before. I wrote a 7-paragraph story, and one paragraph described what Nakba Day is, what happened on May 14th, 1948. And I said it was the British left and a war began. And the result was hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees. The fact is that there were 300,000 Palestinian refugees before May 15th, because already in April, it was like the way the market corrects itself in advance. Already everyone knew the Brits were going, and the war effectively began early. And the Haganah was attacking villages, and people were made refugees before May 15th. And of course, you know, various Palestinian advocates, you know, sent me enormous tomes about what a jerk I am. But I mean, they had a point. And the next time I wrote about it, I modified my language. Because their argument is the whole thing was an ethnic cleansing from the beginning. The Jews knew, they'd been planning it for 10 years, and it had nothing to do with the war. the refugees and the war were unrelated phenomena. I'm not persuaded of that, but they are right that there were refugees before the war.
I guess.
It's up to you. Sure, we want to stop?
Take another one.
Okay.
How do groups like Media Central and Israel Times help you in reporting stories? And also, do you read Canberra's criticisms of your work, and do they help you at all?
Canberra doesn't help me very much, no. You asked about Canberra at the end there? Yeah, no, they don't help me. They don't like me, and they don't help me. Media Central and the Israel Project do help. They often offer debates, or they will host people, and you're welcome to go there. They'll suggest people to talk to. They'll persuade a minister to come have lunch. And I go. It's helpful. I got no problem with it. It's good.
First of all, I want to say just one thing about. I want to make a comment on what Ethan Bronner said at the very beginning. Is that he told us that he has to operate in a place often where it's very gray. And it reminded me of something that Charlene Hunter-Gault, a former New York Times correspondent and a former correspondent, still correspondent to a degree for NPR, said about what her fortune had been as a journalist, to be able to work for organizations like the New York Times and NPR, where, as she said, we're allowed to actually go into that area where it isn't black and white, because often that's where the truth actually can't be seen clearly, but it often lies there. And it's a very hard place for us to go. And on behalf of journalists who are given that opportunity to explore from one side of the equation to the other, and may wind up in the middle, what we've heard tonight, I think, and I'm sure Yoram would agree, is a very powerful presentation of the complexities of being both a journalist, thank you for great questions of Ethan, and also his extraordinary descriptions of what he confronts as an individual trying to find out and to convey to others as accurately as he can what he understands to be both what's happening now and to think about the consequences of that. It's a very powerful place that he's been reporting from. He's a great correspondent, and it's been a great conversation. And thank you all for engaging.
Questions? Thank you.